It was a quiet summer morning in Oakwood Estates, the kind of morning when everything looked perfect on the surface. The air smelled of fresh-cut grass, sprinklers hissed softly, and birds sang over rows of identical houses. But for Mark Thompson, peace ended the moment he stepped onto his porch. There, taped to his front door, was an envelope marked in bold red letters. Violation notice, public hearing required. Mark froze. His heart sank. He wasn't a troublemaker. His lawn was trimmed, his dues were paid on time, and he followed every HOA rule to the letter. Still, his name was on that notice like a public brand of shame. He tore the envelope open, hands trembling slightly. The letter inside was cold and formal, every word dripping with arrogance. You are in violation of Section 4B, decorating your porch with non-approved items that damage the neighborhood's appearance. Mark blinked in disbelief. He looked at his porch, the same porch he'd cared for since his wife Lily passed away 2 years ago. The non-approved items were a few small American flags and flower pots Lily had planted before she died. They were his only link to her memory. He whispered under his breath, "This has to be a mistake." But it wasn't. 2 hours later, a neighbor sent him a screenshot from the community Facebook group. There it was, his porch, photographed and posted publicly by the HOA president, captioned, "An example of what not to do if you care about our community's standards." The comments burned worse than the notice itself. So tacky. Looks like a yard sale. Why can't people just follow rules? Each line felt like a stab. Mark sat on his porch steps, staring at the flags fluttering softly in the breeze. Those flowers, once symbols of love, now looked like evidence in a crime he never committed. By sunset, the whispers had already begun. Neighbors who used to wave now avoided eye contact. The HOA patrol car drove by slowly, twice. Even the mailman hesitated before handing him letters. It was as if Mark had suddenly become the villain of the neighborhood. But deep down, Mark knew something was off. The HOA didn't target people over flower pots. This wasn't about porch decorations, it was personal. He thought back to the last HOA meeting he attended, where he'd questioned the board about a new $50 maintenance fee. The president, Karen Walsh, hadn't liked that. She'd smiled tightly and said, "Some people don't understand how communities stay beautiful." Maybe this was her payback. Mark crumpled the notice in his fist. His blood boiled, but his mind stayed sharp. If Karen and her friends thought they could humiliate him into silence, they had picked the wrong man. As the sun dipped below the rooftops, Mark made a quiet promise to himself. "I'll find out why they're really doing this. And I'll make them regret it." The street lights flickered on. The perfect, peaceful neighborhood looked the same to everyone else. But under that calm surface, something dark had begun. A war, one that started with a single letter on a front door. Mark didn't sleep that night. He sat at his desk with a mug of cold coffee and a copy of the HOA bylaws glowing on his laptop screen. The words blurred together, endless paragraphs of rules about grass height, mailbox colors, and porch decorations. Most of it was nonsense, but he was looking for something specific. A weakness. By the third hour he found it. A line buried deep in the fine print. Decorative items on porches must not exceed the limit of 6 items unless approved by the HOA board. Mark counted his own, 4 flags and 2 flower pots. Exactly 6. So why had he been cited for breaking a rule he hadn't broken? He grabbed his phone and started making notes. Something wasn't adding up. The next day, instead of hiding, Mark went for a walk. Not a normal walk, an inspection of his own. He moved quietly down the street, pretending to admire lawns while taking mental notes. At the corner house, Karen Walsh's home stood like a museum. Large metal gate, hanging lights, a fountain, even garden gnomes. Way more than 6 items. Across the street, Doug had a massive tool shed that clearly wasn't on the original neighborhood plan. Mark smiled to himself. So the rules don't apply to them, huh? He snapped a few photos. Nothing dramatic, just evidence. Then he spoke to a few neighbors in private. At first, they were nervous to talk, but soon the truth started coming out. Several homeowners had been fined for minor things. A faded mailbox, a mismatched flower color, even a kid's bike left outside. And every single complaint had come from the same people, Karen and Doug. Mark started collecting stories, screenshots, and dates. The more he learned, the clearer it became. The HOA wasn't protecting the neighborhood. It was protecting itself. That evening, he opened his laptop again and created a folder called HOA Evidence. One by one, he added photos, copies of posts, and voice memos from neighbors too scared to speak up publicly. He was no longer just defending himself. He was building a case. As thunder rolled in the distance, Mark looked at his porch through the window. The flags and flowers swayed in the wind, brave and stubborn, just like Lily had been. He whispered, "They wanted to shame me. Let's see how they like the spotlight." For the first time in days, Mark smiled. The HOA had started this fight. Now he was ready to finish it. 2 weeks later, the letter came again, this time in bold, all caps. Mandatory public hearing, failure to appear will result in fines. It was clear. The HOA wanted to make an example out of Mark. The hearing was scheduled for Saturday morning in the community hall. By the time Mark arrived, rows of folding chairs were already filled. Some neighbors sat quietly, others whispered behind their hands. At the front, the HOA board sat like judges. Karen in the middle, Doug to her right, and 2 silent board members who looked uncomfortable. Karen greeted him with a thin smile. "Ah, Mr. Thompson. Glad you decided to show up." Mark didn't respond. He just took a seat near the front, his folder of notes resting calmly on his lap. The meeting began with the usual formalities, roll call, introductions, and fake smiles. Then Karen's tone shifted. She leaned toward the microphone and said, "Today we are here to discuss one resident's continued disregard for our community standards." Doug clicked through a slideshow. Photos of Mark's porch appeared on the projector screen, zoomed in and labeled with red arrows as if they were evidence from a crime scene. The audience murmured. Karen continued, "We take pride in Oakwood Estates. Allowing violations like this sends the wrong message. Mr. Thompson, would you care to explain why you think you're above the rules?" Mark stood up slowly. "Above the rules?" He looked around the room. "I think that's a question better asked of this board." Karen's smile faded slightly. "Excuse me?" He walked toward the projector and pulled out his folder. According to Section 4B, porch decorations are limited to 6 items unless approved by the board. "I have 6. But since we're showing photos today, let's look at a few others." Mark placed his own pictures on the projector. Karen's glowing gate, Doug's backyard shed, and another board member's string lights. The room went silent. Then whispers began to spread through the crowd. "Wait, isn't that her house? She's got more decorations than anyone." Karen's face went pale. Doug fumbled with the laptop. "This isn't relevant." "Oh, it's very relevant," Mark interrupted, his voice steady. "You accuse me publicly. Now the community deserves to know the truth." A few people started clapping. Someone took out their phone and began recording. Karen tried to regain control. "This meeting is adjourned." But it was too late. The audience was awake now, angry, curious, and finally questioning the people who had been ruling them with fear. Mark didn't need to say another word. He closed his folder, gave one last look at Karen, and walked out as the room erupted in noise. For the first time in weeks he felt free. But deep down he knew this was only the beginning. Writing. By Sunday morning the entire neighborhood was talking. The video from the hearing had spread faster than anyone expected. Someone had posted it on the Oakwood Estates Facebook group, and from there, it made its way into local community pages. Within a day it had over 5,000 views. The comments were brutal, but not for Mark. They were for the HOA. So the president breaks her own rules? Wow, power really got to her head. Good for that guy for standing up to them. Karen tried to delete the post, but screenshots had already been shared everywhere. Doug sent out a long, defensive statement claiming that the meeting was taken out of context, but no one was buying it. For the first time, the HOA's perfect image was cracked wide open. Neighbors who had once been afraid started speaking out. People shared their own stories, unfair fines, rude comments, threats of penalties. The same pattern appeared again and again. Small mistakes turned into public humiliation. Mark watched all this unfold quietly. He didn't brag or post anything himself. He didn't need to. The truth was doing the work for him. 3 days later, a city inspector showed up at Oakwood Estates. Someone, Mark never said who, had filed a report about possible misuse of HOA funds. The inspector started asking questions, and suddenly Karen's confident tone disappeared. Doug avoided his neighbors entirely. One of the board members resigned the next morning, citing stress and disagreement with leadership. The atmosphere in the neighborhood had completely changed. Where there had once been silence and fear, now there was anger and unity. People gathered in driveways, talking openly about new elections, transparency, and change. Karen, desperate to regain control, sent out an emergency newsletter claiming false accusations were damaging the community's reputation. But no one cared anymore. That evening, Mark sat on his porch again. His flags fluttered gently in the breeze, just as they always had. Neighbors passing by smiled at him now, not fake smiles but real ones. He didn't say much, just nodded in return. Deep down, he knew the HOA's plan to humiliate him had completely backfired. And the best part? The fight wasn't over yet. The truth was only beginning to surface. By the end of the week, Oakwood Estates was in chaos. The HOA, once feared and untouchable, was falling apart from the inside. The city inspector's visit had turned into a full-blown audit. Rumors spread that the board had been using HOA money for maintenance projects that didn't exist. New lighting, repainting, landscaping, all conveniently contracted to companies owned by Doug's relatives. When proof began to surface, people were furious. Homeowners who'd been scared to speak before were now marching into the HOA office, demanding answers. Karen tried to hold an emergency meeting to calm everyone down, but barely anyone showed up. Within days, 2 more board members resigned. Doug disappeared from every community chat, and Karen, she finally stepped down, claiming she needed a break for personal reasons. But everyone knew the truth. The HOA had humiliated the wrong man, and now it was their turn. For Mark, life began to change quickly. Neighbors who had once avoided him came by to apologize. Judy brought over fresh muffins, saying, "You were right about them all along, Mark. We just didn't have the courage to say anything." He thanked her kindly but never gloated. That wasn't who he was. Instead, he helped organize a community cleanup, something the old board never did. People laughed again. Kids played in the streets without being told their bikes lowered property value. One evening, as Mark repainted his porch railing, Doug's old shed was being dismantled down the road. The sound of hammers echoed like justice. Mark paused for a moment, watching the flags on his porch sway in the evening breeze. The same flags that had started it all. He smiled, not out of pride but relief. He whispered to himself, "Lily, I did it. They can't hurt anyone else now." The HOA's iron grip was gone, and for the first time in years, Oakwood Estates truly felt like a neighborhood again. But the story wasn't over yet. There was still one more meeting to come, one that would change everything for good. A month later, a soft breeze carried the sound of laughter across Oakwood Estates. The air felt lighter, freer, different. The fear that once lingered in every corner of the neighborhood was gone. A notice went out announcing the new HOA election. For the first time, people were actually excited about it. The days of silence and control were over. This time, homeowners wanted leaders who cared about fairness, not power. When nominations opened, several neighbors suggested Mark's name. He refused at first. "I'm not a politician," he said with a small smile. But the crowd insisted. "You stood up when no one else did," said Judy. "We trust you." After some thought, Mark agreed, not to seek revenge but to make sure no one else would ever be treated the way he was. The vote was simple and honest. When the results came in, Mark Thompson became the new HOA president of Oakwood Estates. His first act as president wasn't a speech or a new rule, it was a gesture. He gathered everyone at the community park, helped repaint the old benches, and planted new flowers under the welcome sign. On each pot, he placed a small flag, the same kind that once got him into trouble. Neighbors clapped and laughed as he stood beside them, not above them. "This neighborhood isn't about power or punishment," Mark said softly. "It's about people. About home." Under his leadership, things began to change. The HOA stopped using threats and started using teamwork. Fines became last resorts, not weapons. And every new rule had to be approved by the community, not just a few at the top. One evening, Mark sat on his porch again, just as he had on that first terrible day. The sunset painted the sky gold and pink. His flags fluttered gently, and the flowers Lily had planted years ago bloomed brighter than ever. He smiled, sipping his coffee, watching kids play in the street while neighbors chatted nearby. Oakwood Estates finally looked like the place it had always claimed to be, a real community. A soft voice in his head seemed to whisper, "They wanted to humiliate you, Mark, but you taught them what respect really means." And as the porch light came on, Mark knew, this was more than a victory. It was a new beginning. Years passed, and Oakwood Estates never returned to its old ways. The flowers along the walkways grew brighter each season, and the sound of kids laughing filled every street. The neighborhood had changed, not just in rules but in spirit. Under Mark's quiet leadership, the HOA became something people were proud of. Meetings turned into friendly gatherings and ideas replaced arguments. When someone struggled to maintain their yard, volunteers showed up instead of fines. The community finally lived up to its name. One warm afternoon, Mark sat at the same kitchen table where he had once studied those bylaws by lamplight. His folder of HOA evidence still rested on a shelf nearby, a reminder of how far they'd come. He smiled as he looked through the window, seeing neighbors talking over fences and helping one another. He picked up a framed photo of Lily. Her smile was gentle, the way he remembered her best. "We did it, Lily," he whispered. "They finally understand what community means." That evening, as the sun dipped below the rooftops, the porch lights of Oakwood Estates flickered on one by one, glowing softly like a chain of promises kept. Mark closed his eyes and listened to the calm hum of life around him. He had started as one man standing against power, and ended as the heart of a neighborhood reborn. Because sometimes, the loudest change doesn't come from anger or revenge. It comes from doing what's right even when you stand alone. And with that, the story of Oakwood Estates came full circle, where humiliation turned into honor, and one man's courage became a legacy.